There is a place in the Santa Barbara Hills that does not feel like it belongs to the living world anymore. It sits behind iron gates on 2,700 acres of California land, tucked away from a world that has spent nearly 2 decades trying to figure out what to do with its memory. You can drive past the entrance and feel nothing unusual. The hills are green. The sky is quiet. The gates are closed. But if you know what once existed on the other side of those gates, you cannot drive past without feeling something pull at you. Something unresolved. Something enormous. This is what remains of Neverland Ranch. And 17 years after the man who built it took his last breath in a rented house on the other side of Los Angeles, this property still refuses to let itself be forgotten. That alone is remarkable. Most celebrity estates fade. They get sold, renovated, absorbed into the real estate market, and quietly stripped of whatever meaning they once carried. That is not what happened here. What happened here is different. What happened here is stranger, sadder, and far more difficult to look away from. Because Neverland was never really a house. It was an argument. A giant, extravagant, obsessively constructed argument that one of the most famous human beings who ever lived was trying to make with the world around him. And that argument never fully resolved. Not when he was alive. Not when the gates finally closed. Not now. To understand what this place actually was, you have to start not with the property itself, but with the person who needed it. Michael Jackson bought the ranch in 1988 for $17 million. He was 30 years old. He was the most recognizable face on the planet. He had spent the better part of his childhood on stages, in recording studios, under lights so bright they should have been a childhood's reward rather than its replacement. He had performed since he was 5 years old. He had watched other children play from the windows of tour buses. He had been managed, rehearsed, disciplined, and polished into something extraordinary before he ever had the chance to understand what ordinary felt like. And then, at the moment in his life when he could have had anything, he chose to build a world that looked like a boy's dream. The name was not accidental. Neverland. The island from a story. The place where the lost boys go. The place where a child never has to grow up. He did not name this property after a place of wealth or power or prestige. He named it after a place of escape. That choice tells you almost everything you need to know about what was really being built out here on these California hillsides. This was not architecture. This was autobiography. Every dollar spent, every structure raised, every carousel placed on these grounds was Michael Jackson writing a confession in concrete and steel about the childhood he had lost before he ever understood that it was gone. He poured roughly $35 million into the property after buying it. That number alone should make you pause. $35 million, on top of the purchase price, on top of the maintenance, on top of the ongoing cost of running what was essentially a small private theme park. The total investment was staggering. And when you look at what that money actually built, you understand that this was not a man decorating a home. This was a man building an entire alternative reality. The main house was a 13,000 square foot French country estate. Inside, the floors in the kitchen had been taken from an actual 18th century French chateau, dismantled piece by piece in France, and then shipped across the ocean to be reassembled here by craftsmen who reportedly lived on the property for 2 years, getting every detail right. The foyer held paintings that covered entire walls and a 2-sided marble clock, so heavy that the floor beneath it had to be structurally reinforced before it could bear the weight. There was a rotating pedestal in the living room holding an Academy Award Oscar from 1939 that Jackson had purchased at auction for $1.5 million, positioned so that every guest who walked through the front door could see it turning slowly on display. The grand piano nearby was covered in dozens of framed photographs. Friends, family, moments. A museum of personal connection placed at the center of a room that was itself inside a world he had built entirely for himself. But the house was almost beside the point. What made Neverland truly unlike anything else that has ever existed in private real estate was what surrounded it. A 4-acre lake with a waterfall, a 50-seat movie theater, a full amusement park with a Ferris wheel and carousel that he could operate privately for himself and his guests. a petting zoo that housed llamas, chimpanzees, and dozens of other animals, a basketball court, a tennis court, a firehouse, a barn, guest cottages, and threading through all of it, a fully operational private rail system, a rail train station, complete with a bank of monitors, staffed and stocked, running on tracks that wound through the property and carried passengers through a landscape that had been planted and designed to feel like the grounds of an enchanted world. There is no other private estate in American celebrity history that came close to this. Not in scale, not in ambition, not in the psychological weight of what it meant to its owner. Neverland was not about showing off. There are easier ways to show off when you have that kind of money. Neverland was about something far more personal and far more painful. It was about trying to give yourself the one thing that fame had taken away before you were old enough to realize you needed it. People who worked there describe a place that operated with a strange and total commitment to wonder. The staff wore uniforms. Guests arriving for the first time would encounter a butler statue near the entrance, positioned near the front door with a silver tray carrying cookies, a gesture of welcome frozen in bronze. Every detail had been considered. Every corner had been touched by intention. The landscaping near the train station was designed to look like Disneyland. In one section of the property, the word Neverland itself had been spelled out in living plants visible from above. This was a man who did not just want to live in a magical place. He wanted the magic to be readable from the sky. And for a while, for a stretch of years in the late 1980s and through the 1990s, that is exactly what this place was. A world unto itself. A private fantasy that happened to exist on real soil in real California. People who were fortunate enough to be guests there spoke afterward about the feeling of crossing through those gates and stepping into something that did not behave like the ordinary world. The noise of everything else dropped away. The scale of the property swallowed you whole. And somewhere in the middle of all that spectacle was a man who, by all accounts, was genuinely happiest here, away from the cameras and the headlines and the impossible weight of his own fame. The tragedy is that it could not last. The first crack came not gradually, but all at once, and it came in a form that would permanently alter the meaning of everything this property represented. In November 2003, police arrived at Neverland Ranch with a search warrant. The images that emerged from that day were striking not just for what they showed, but for what they meant. A place built around innocence was suddenly being investigated. A property that had been designed to feel like a children's dream was now being examined by law enforcement, looking for evidence of something entirely different. Jackson was not there when the search happened. The footage of investigators moving through the property, through the main house, through the private rooms, through the sleeping loft above the master suite, had a quality to it that was almost surreal. Because the property itself remained unchanged. The carousel was still there. The train was still there. The paintings and the statues and the marble clock and the rotating Oscar and the photographs on the piano were still there. Everything looked exactly as it always had. But the meaning of it had shifted in an instant. What had been presented to the world as a place of wonder was now being parsed as a crime scene. The trial that followed lasted months. Jackson was acquitted of all charges in 2005. But the acquittal did not restore what had been taken. He walked out of that courthouse a free man, and then he left. He left California. He left the country for a period. And he never went back to Neverland. Not once. Not in the 4 years between the verdict and his death in June 2009. Whatever the ranch had meant to him, whatever it had represented, whatever need it had been built to fill, something about it had changed too much to return to. Some people who knew him said the place had become too painful, that the memory of the investigation, the images of strangers moving through rooms he had considered sacred, the public exposure of spaces he had kept private, had stripped the property of whatever protective feeling it had once carried. The man who had built Neverland to escape the world had watched the world walk through Neverland uninvited. And after that, he could not go back. By the time he died at the age of 50, on June 25, 2009, in a rented mansion in Holmby Hills with a doctor present and an injection of propofol in his system, Neverland had been sitting empty for 4 years. The animals had been removed. Some of the rides had been shut down. The train still sat on its tracks, but no one was running it. The staff who had maintained the property for decades were navigating the strange work of keeping an enormous estate operational without its owner ever being there to need it. And then things got worse. In 2008, a year before his death, Jackson had defaulted on a $24.5 million loan tied to the property. The financial structure behind Neverland had been unraveling for years, and the default was the clearest public signal yet that the dream had run out of money to hold itself together. Colony Capital, the investment firm that stepped in to handle the debt and prevent a foreclosure sale, acquired a stake in the property and eventually began the process of stripping out its most iconic features. The petting zoo was dismantled. The animals were relocated. The amusement rides were removed from the property and sold. And then something happened that is, if you think about it long enough, almost too perfect in its melancholy. Those rides, the ones that had once operated exclusively for the private guests of one of the most famous people in history, ended up scattered across fairgrounds in California, Oregon, and Washington. Some were reported to have found permanent homes at places like Coney Island and at Beach Bend Park. The carousel that had turned in Michael Jackson's private paradise was now carrying strangers at a state fair somewhere. The Ferris wheel that had been part of a world built around one man's need for wonder was now just an amusement ride in a public lot. There is a whole essay in that image, if you want to find it. The property went on the market, first in 2015, listed at $100 million. That number attracted attention, but no buyer. Then it was repriced at $67 million. No sale. Then $31 million. Still nothing. And finally, in 2020, Ron Burkle, the American billionaire businessman, purchased the estate for $22 million. A property that had absorbed more than $50 million in purchase price and renovation costs over the years. A property that had once been described as the most remarkable private estate in America. Sold for $22 million. That number is not just a data point. It is a verdict. A quiet and devastating verdict about what time and controversy do to the things we build. Burkle renamed it Sycamore Valley Ranch. The name Neverland disappeared from the gates and from the official records, though it never disappeared from a conversation. By 2022, county permits confirmed that work was actively underway on the property. Roofing repairs, electrical upgrades, structural restoration on the buildings that remained. The new owner had made clear he intended to restore what was left of the estate rather than demolish it, and reports throughout that period described a steady stream of workers and materials moving in and out through the old gates. What that means in practical terms is that Neverland or Sycamore Valley Ranch, or whatever you choose to call it, is not an abandoned ruin. It is a working private property being actively maintained and improved. The public will almost certainly never have access to it. There are no tours. There are no visits. The gates that once opened to welcome guests for private screenings and birthday parties and gatherings that live in the memories of the people who attended them are now closed to everyone without a specific invitation from the current owner. But here is where the story takes one of its stranger recent turns. In 2024, the property came back into the news. Not because it was sold again, and not because of any legal development. It came back because Hollywood arrived at the gates. Production crews working on the Michael Jackson biopic, a major film about his life, obtained permits to film on the property itself. The ranch that had been sealed away from public view for years suddenly had cameras on it again. And not just any cameras. Cameras that were there to recreate the world the place had once actually been. The filming permits confirmed that scenes including dialogue, petting zoo sequences, and stunt work were all shot on the grounds. For a brief period, actors and crew walked through the spaces that the real Michael Jackson had once occupied. The train station that had sat quiet for over a decade was used as a backdrop for scenes about the man who had built it. The house that had held a rotating Oscar and a marble-reinforced floor and photographs lined along the lid of a grand piano was a film set again. And then the project ran into something that Neverland has always been very good at producing. Complication. The original version of the biopic included a recreation of the 1993 allegations and the subsequent raid on the property. Some of that footage was actually filmed. But legal issues connected to Jackson's settlement with the Chandler family ultimately forced the production to remove the scenes. They could not use them. So Neverland ended up playing two entirely different roles in the making of this film. It was a filming location for the story of Michael Jackson's life. And it was the specific place where the film ran into the limits of what could be told. You could spend a long time thinking about the symbolism in that. The ranch has always been exactly this. A place where Jackson's story is both most visible and most complicated. A place where the fantasy and the fallout exist in the same physical space, sometimes in the same room. The sleeping loft where he retreated from the world sits in the same structure that investigators walked through with search warrants. The movie theater where he hosted private screenings was examined by law enforcement looking for evidence. The kitchen floors brought from an 18th century chateau in France are in the same house where a man who sold more records than almost anyone in history quietly stopped returning to the one place he had called home. That collision is what makes Neverland impossible to reduce to a single story. If you try to tell it only as a story of extravagance, you miss the longing that built it. If you tell it only as a story of a lost childhood, you are ignoring the darkness that gathered around it. If you tell it only as a legal story, you are stripping it of the genuine wonder that the place represented to the people who experienced it at its peak. And if you tell it only as a real estate story, the numbers make no sense unless you understand what the property was trying to be when the money was being spent. Neverland is all of these things simultaneously. That is what makes it still matter. That is what makes it the subject of conversations and YouTube videos and news articles and film productions 17 years after the man who built it was buried. Because it is not just a house. It is the most literal and enormous physical expression of who Michael Jackson was, what he needed, what he feared, what he tried to build against the world, and what the world ultimately did to the thing he built. The fans who found the property over the years, those who made pilgrimages to the gate, who carved messages into the rocks near the entrance, who left behind tributes that say things like "Thank you for everything," and "Mexico will always love you," and "It is all for love." Those people understood something about this place that the real estate listings never quite captured. They understood that Neverland was always more memorial than mansion, that the value it held had nothing to do with acreage or square footage or the market rate for a private rail system. The messages carved into those rocks are still there, faded, some of them, worn by years of weather and exposure, but still readable if you get close enough. And if you read them, you realize that the people who left them were not grieving a celebrity. They were grieving something more specific. They were grieving the idea of a person who tried very hard to make the world feel like a place worth loving, who built an entire private country to make that feeling permanent, and who ultimately could not hold it together. That grief is real, and it belongs to the property as much as any structure on it. What sits on those 2,700 acres today is something genuinely unusual in celebrity history. It is a place that has not quite become anything else yet. It is no longer what it was. The amusement park is gone. The animals are gone. The train may or may not still run on its tracks. The name has changed. The owner has changed. The purpose has changed. But the presence has not changed. The sense that something extraordinary and irreplaceable happened here, and that the echo of it has not finished sounding, has not changed. Ron Burkle is restoring the buildings. The crews are working. The permits are being pulled, and the work is being done, and the property is slowly becoming whatever it is going to become next. But it has not become that thing yet. Right now, in 2026, it is still in between. Still in the space between what it was and what it will be. Still carrying a history that no renovation permit can address. That in-between quality might be the most honest thing about Neverland. It has always existed between things. Between fantasy and reality. Between childhood and adulthood. Between innocence and investigation. Between one of the greatest artistic legacies in the history of popular music and one of the most painful and contested personal histories that legacy has ever been attached to. And now it exists between past and future, between the man who built it and whatever comes next, between a $22 million purchase price and whatever the property eventually becomes for its new owner, between the fans still carving their messages into rocks outside the gate and the film crews who arrived with cameras to make a movie about the man who was never going to come home. There is a detail from the property's peak that stays with you once you hear it. One of the people who worked at Neverland, one of the staff members who spent years inside those grounds, described the bedroom suite, the sleeping loft above the main master level, the walk-in closets, the jacuzzi, the staircase leading up to where the bed sat against the wall. The bedspread, she said, was covered entirely in sequins. The same sequins that covered the gloves and the jackets and the costumes that the whole world recognized. The same deliberate, impossibly detailed shimmer. Even in the private space where no one was watching, even in the room that was built only for him, everything had to carry that quality, that commitment to a certain kind of brightness. It is a small detail, but it might be the truest window into what Neverland actually was. Not just a place where Michael Jackson lived, but a place where he continued to live in the only language he fully understood, where even the bed you slept in had to feel like the stage you had never really been allowed to leave. Neverland is still there. The gates are still closed. The land is still enormous. The hills are still quiet in the way that only very large pieces of land in California can be quiet. Somewhere on the property, the structures that once held all of that spectacle are being worked on by crews who probably do not think too hard about the weight of what they are restoring. But the story is still there too, written into every acre of it, the way he wrote sequins into a bedspread that no camera was ever supposed to see. Still present, still particular, still capable of pulling you in every single time his name comes back into the conversation. Which, if history is any guide, it will. Again and again and again. Because Neverland does exactly what it was always named for. It refuses to end.